Hi, my name is Michael Lind. I'm the Policy Director of the Economic Growth Program at the New America Foundation. And my guest today is Sam Tanenhaus, editor of the New York Times Book Review and the Week in Review, and author of a provocative new book, The Death of Conservatism. Thanks for coming.
Oh, glad to be here, Mike.
Well, if conservatism is dead, when was it born?
Well, I think true conservatism, the conservatism I look back to, was really invented by Edmund Burke, the time of the French Revolution in the late 18th century. I think American conservatism really came into being as a serious movement in the 1950s, when the leading figures were William F. Buckley Jr., Whittaker Chambers, and Senator Joseph McCarthy. I think it was a kind of a conversation among those three, or conflicts among them, that actually gave us the movement we know today.
Well, this was in fact called movement conservatism.
Yes, and that's what's essential about conservatism. I say in the book that there have been many movements in American history, but movement conservatism is the only one that really began as a political one. The others, abolition, suffrage, the environmentalist movement, anti-war movement, civil rights, these were more social than political movements. They found political outlets. But this was a truly political movement. It's about power. And that's why we see it take the course that it followed.
Well, speaking of power, the conventional history has it beginning with Barry Goldwater and then triumphing with Ronald Reagan in 1980. You argue that this leaves out Richard Nixon.
Yes, I think Nixon was really important because he was the first political figure on the right, the first Republican who was able, once the Goldwater idea of a very polarized politics was created, was actually able to move to the center, to take that politics to the center. Also, Nixon is unusual because he was a kind of accommodator of liberal policy. And so those two poles of a kind of cultural, values-driven movement conservatism on the one hand, and a more pragmatic post-New Deal liberalism combined give us conservatism at its best. And Nixon, had he not been a criminal, might have been our great conservative president.
Well, speaking of Nixon, one of the post-New Deal liberals was Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who, along with a lot of the original neoconservatives, were actually Kennedy Johnson Democrats, and yet they found common cause on some subjects with the movement conservatives in the 60s and 70s.
Yes, it's what Moynihan, in a brilliant address he gave in Washington in 1967, called the politics of stability, a notion that came directly out of Edmund Burke, that the society had become so fractured, so anarchic, so violent, anti-war protests of a militant kind, extreme sort of anti-government militant leftists, some of that on the right, a war the nation was losing, 2 political assassinations in 1968, urban discord that destroyed some of the great cities in this country, that Moynihan and Nixon and Buckley and a few others saw that right and left, at least temporarily, had to set aside their ideological differences and converge in the classic consensus way to preserve the structure of government and the social institutions that dominate our life.
Well, a lot of people date the end of the conservative era to the election of Barack Obama in 2008. But you argue that 1992 would be a better date.
Yes. There are several reasons for this. The most important is that if we look over the history of presidential elections, and I think those are the dominant ones. I agree with you. The presidential elections really are the most significant indicator of where the country at large is. We see Democrats have won 4 of the last 5, dating back to 1992. We forget that Bill Clinton's victory then, though it was weakened by the presence of a strong third-party candidate, H. Ross Perot, was essentially as large as Barack Obama's in 2008. The percentage of the popular vote was slightly smaller. The electoral vote was actually slightly larger. He had equivalent majorities in both houses of Congress. More important, the defeated Republican, George H.W. Bush, got a lower percentage of the vote than Herbert Hoover got in 1932 when the Great New Deal tide swept in. And so I think if we look at the rise and fall of conservatism, we see a key moment actually began then.
Well, Bill Clinton, you argue, along with Dwight Eisenhower, was what you consider a true, a genuine Burkean conservative. What does that mean?
Well, it means that Clinton, who entered office as a kind of standard issue liberal Democrat, a Kennedy Johnson Democrat who believed in the power of big government, who believed in social programs to aid the disadvantaged and the poor and such, but also was connected with the middle class, saw that he was really a successor to Ronald Reagan, that the politics of the unleashed market supported by the government had become so effective and so accepted by the public at large that Clinton really had to change course. And he had to govern as a kind of conservative Democrat who was very closely allied to big business and to the marketplace. And so the adjustments Clinton made strike me as being classically those that Edmund Burke prescribed for all statesmen.
And that would be true of Eisenhower as well.
Eisenhower, the case mirrors it. Eisenhower followed 2 decades of New Deal politics and saw that the country had adjusted to that the New Deal had become ingrained in the fabric of our political and social life, that a greatly enlarged federal government was here to stay, and that his job as a Republican was to be a kind of guardian of that government, to make sure it didn't get too big, but also to make sure it stayed in place. And that also seems like a Burkean adjustment to me.
Well, if I understand you, you're suggesting that conservatism as a style of governance is arguably incompatible with or threatened by conservatism as a movement. That maybe the movement must fail in order for the temperament to succeed.
That is what I think. I think what we think of as conservatives, movement conservatives, are really radicals. I think they despise government.
We call them revanchists.
Yeah, revanchists. They despise government. They despise society. Many of the social institutions, our universities, our media. They don't like lawyers. They often don't like doctors. They don't like professional experts.
So it's a countercultural.
It's a countercultural kind of war, and it's a culture war. And that what they want to do, it's the reason I call them revanchists, revenge means revenge. It's a politics of revenge and restoration. And this is what we see time and again from conservatives. When they talk about new ideas or taking the country forward, they're really talking about reviving what they think was a golden earlier period in our history.
Well, Paul Weyrich, a leading conservative shortly before he died, declared that they had lost the culture war. And I think that shows the extent of alienation, at least on the part of some conservatives. He argued for retreating to sort of small monastic communities and being like the Amish.
Well, he's not alone in that. You know, William Bennett has made somewhat similar arguments. Robert Bork did during the Clinton impeachment, 10 or 11 years ago. There was much anger from the cultural conservatives that the American people had let them down. They weren't punitive enough.
Do you see a new movement, at least with the organized apparatus of intellectuals and journals and serious thought, succeeding the movement conservatism that's dead now, or is that not in the cards?
I don't see it yet. I'm not sure we really want it. I think once conservatism came of age, I think it should stop being a movement. It doesn't mean there shouldn't be a series of thinkers and writers who have much to teach us, as the James Burnhams and William Buckleys did. But a movement I don't think we really need at this point.
Sam Tanenhaus, thank you.
Thank you, Mike.
Appreciate it.